The sun is rising over a ruined coast, but it offers no warmth, only a pale, indifferent light that reveals the magnitude of the silence. Close your eyes and let the darkness of your own room merge with this ancient twilight, where the air smells faintly of salt, charred cedar, and the copper tang of spilled history. The screaming has finally stopped, replaced by the rhythmic, uncaring lap of the Aegean Sea against the hull of a black ship, and the only movement is the drifting ash that coats the shoulders of weary men like a second skin. We are standing at the end of an age, in the moment immediately following the collapse of a civilization where the adrenaline of survival has faded, leaving only a hollow, ringing quiet that feels heavier than armor. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, breathe in the stillness of this aftermath. The year is roughly 1200 BC, a time the history books call the Bronze Age collapse. But for the man standing at the water's edge, it is simply the end of the world. He is not the marble statue you have seen in museums, pristine and white. He is a living, breathing man, covered in dust and dried blood. His skin weathered by 10 years of wind and sun, his eyes scanning the horizon, not for glory, but for a way out. This is Odysseus. In the popular imagination, he is a hero of high adventure, a favorite of the goddess Athena. But if we strip away the layers of epic poetry and look at the archaeological reality of this era, we find a much starker truth. He was a warlord in a time of apocalypse. The great empires of the Mediterranean, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, were all crumbling under the weight of famine, earthquake, and the relentless invasions of the mysterious sea peoples, marauders who left nothing but ruin in their wake. Odysseus was a product of this terrified, violent age, a chieftain from a rocky, insignificant island called Ithaca, who had been dragged into a conflict he never wanted, a war that was less about the romance of Helen and more about the desperate resource-grabbing of dying kingdoms. As he looks back at the smoldering remains of Troy, he does not feel the swell of pride that the poets will later invent for him. He feels the crushing weight of the Nostos, the return. He knows that the world he left 10 years ago may not be there when he gets back, for the communication networks of the Bronze Age have been severed, and silence has fallen over the trade routes. The man we see is defined by a singular, ruthless quality that the Greeks called metis, a cunning intelligence, a localized pragmatism that borders on deceit. While other heroes like Achilles sought immortality through glorious death, Odysseus seeks only one thing: to survive. He is the man who calculates the odds. As the morning mist curls around the prows of his ships, he is already running the numbers, understanding that the physical war is over. But the psychological war, the war against the sea, against the gods, and against his own trauma, is just beginning. He watches his men loading the spoils of war, the gold cups and woven tapestries that now seem so trivial compared to the cost of acquiring them. And he realizes that they are not just carrying treasure. They are carrying ghosts. Every item is a tether to the violence they committed the night before. A night of sacrilege that will haunt them across the water. The wind shifts, coming from the north, cold and biting, blowing the smoke away from the land and out towards the open ocean, signaling that it is time to leave. This is the moment of departure, the pivot point between the solid earth of the battlefield and the fluid, treacherous uncertainty of the voyage. It is a moment of profound hesitation. To step onto the ship is to surrender control to the elements, to trust in wood and rope and the favor of capricious deities who may already have turned their backs. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War was a single siege or a metaphor for centuries of conflict between East and West. But for the man standing on this shore, the distinction is irrelevant. The reality is the soot in his lungs and the scar tissue on his soul. He pushes off from the sand, the friction of the hull against the beach, making a low, grinding sound that vibrates through the soles of his feet, a sensation of finality. As the oars hit the water, breaking the glass-like surface, the rhythm begins, stroke, breath, stroke, breath, a hypnotic cadence that will define the next 10 years of his life. The shore recedes, the fires of the ruined city becoming small, flickering stars in the distance, until they are swallowed by the curvature of the earth. He is alone now, surrounded by the wine-dark sea, a phrase that sounds beautiful in verse, but in reality describes a terrifying, deep purple abyss that promises nothing but oblivion. He is the captain of a vessel drifting through a broken world, a man who has mastered the art of destruction, but must now relearn the art of living. The silence of the open ocean wraps around the ship, vast and indifferent, and in this quiet, we can almost hear the gears of his mind turning, plotting, scheming, always one step ahead of the disaster that follows him like a shadow. He is the architect of his own survival, a man who will lie, cheat, and steal to see the smoke rising from his own hearth again. This is not a fairy tale of knights and damsels. It is the gritty, desperate logbook of a survivor refusing to go gently into the dark. As the coast of Troy vanishes completely, leaving only the endless horizon, Odysseus turns his back on the past and faces the empty blue, unaware that the gods are watching, and they are not pleased. The journey has begun, not with a trumpet blast, but with the quiet creaking of timber and the sigh of the wind in the rigging, a lullaby for the lost, pushing forward into the unknown. To understand why the salt spray feels so bitter on his face now, we must let the current carry us back against the tide of time, drifting away from the ruins of Troy and returning to the rocky, sun-baked soil of Ithaca before the fleet ever launched. The memory of the beginning is perhaps more painful than the war itself, for it was here, on the edge of his own kingdom, that the trap was first sprung. The world was already holding its breath, sensing the tremors of the coming apocalypse, and Odysseus, with his ear pressed to the ground of history, heard the hoofbeats of disaster long before the messengers arrived. He was a king, yes, but of a small, jagged island that demanded hard labor and sharp wits, not the sprawling golden plains of the mainland potentates. He understood the fragility of the Bronze Age economy, a delicate web of palace states dependent on trade winds and harvest cycles, all of which were threatening to snap under the pressure of famine and the terrifying rumors of the sea peoples. In this climate of existential dread, the call to war, the summons from Agamemnon to retrieve Helen, sounded not like a trumpet of honor, but like a death knell for his people. To strip Ithaca of its king and its fighting men was to leave the door open for pirates and marauders, to abandon his family to a world that was rapidly losing its laws. And so the man who would later be celebrated for his mind decided to hide behind a mask of madness, a desperate theatrical gambit to save the only life that truly mattered to him. Picture the scene, stripped of the golden light of romance and viewed through the harsh glare of the Mediterranean noon. The recruiters, led by the shrewd and calculating Palamedes, arrived on the shores of Ithaca expecting a warrior ready for glory. Instead, they found a scene of disturbing surrealism. Odysseus was in his fields, but he was dressed in his ceremonial best, a jarring sight against the dust and the mule dung. He had yoked an ox and a donkey together, two beasts of different strength and temperament, forcing them to pull against each other in a chaotic, lurching rhythm that defied all agricultural logic. Behind them, he drove the plow, but instead of seed grain, he carried a sack of salt, casting the white crystals into the fresh furrows. It was a performance of profound symbolism. To salt the earth is to sterilize it, to ensure that nothing will ever grow there again. He was pantomiming the very futility of the war they were asking him to fight, acting out the destruction of a generation. Yet the visitors saw only a king whose mind had snapped under the weight of his crown. The air was thick with heat, and the sound of the mismatched animals groaning under the yoke, a discordant music that covered the pounding of Odysseus's heart. He was betting everything on this deception, gambling his reputation as a sane man to preserve his reality as a father and a husband. But Palamedes was not a man easily fooled. He was a mirror to Odysseus, possessed of the same sharp, dangerous intelligence, a bureaucrat of death who saw the world as a series of puzzles to be solved. He watched the mad king with a cold, analytical eye, noting the precision with which Odysseus guided the plow, despite his feigned erraticism. Palamedes understood that the draft was not a request. It was a mandate of the coalition, a binding contract forged in the oath of Tyndareus, a pact that obliged all the Greek suitors of Helen to defend her husband. Historians still argue whether the oath of Tyndareus was a genuine diplomatic pact or a later poetic invention designed to justify a massive predatory raid. But in the moment on that field, the political reality was absolute. Palamedes needed Odysseus, not for his sword arm, but for his strategic mind, and he was willing to break the man to get the asset. The test he devised was cruel in its simplicity, a moment that would haunt Odysseus for the next 20 years and fuel a hatred that would eventually turn lethal. Palamedes walked into the house and returned with the infant Telemachus, the child who represented the future of the dynasty, the very reason Odysseus was tearing up his fields with salt. Without a word, the recruiter placed the swaddled bundle on the earth, directly in the path of the oncoming blade. The world seemed to stop spinning. The plow was heavy, its iron share sharpened to slice through roots and rock, and the beasts were moving with the inexorable momentum of the draft. Odysseus had a split second to make a choice that was impossible: maintain the charade and crush his own heart, or reveal his sanity and lose his freedom. It was the first Kobayashi Maru of his life, a no-win scenario engineered by a rival intellect. As the beasts plodded forward, unaware of the stakes, Odysseus's eyes locked onto the fragile form of his son. The mask of the madman dissolved instantly, replaced by the terrifying clarity of the father. He leaned hard into the wood, wrenching the plow violently to the side, carving a jagged scar into the earth as he swerved around the child. The animal stumbled and halted, the dust settling around the untouched infant and the panting, defeated king. The silence that followed was total, Palamedes smiled, a thin, victorious expression that sealed his own fate, though he did not know it yet. "The king is sane," he declared, his voice cutting through the heat like a whip. "He will sail." In that moment, the ploughman died, and the soldier was born. Odysseus was no longer a sovereign protecting his home. He was a cornered animal, a conscript dragged into a conflict he despised. He picked up his son, holding him close for a moment that felt like a goodbye. The smell of the baby's skin imprinting itself on his memory as a talisman against the stench of blood that would soon surround him. The salt he had sown in the fields remained there, a prophecy of the barren years to come, a testament to the fact that even the cleverest man cannot outwit destiny when the war machine begins to turn. He had revealed his metis, his cunning, by trying to hide it, and in doing so, he had proven exactly why the Greeks needed him. He was too valuable to be left behind. As he walked back to his palace to don his armor, the weight of the inevitable settled onto his shoulders. He knew that the Trojan War would be a grinder of men, a long, rotting stalemate that would consume the best of Achaea. He was leaving Ithaca not with the fire of patriotism, but with a cold, hard resolve to return, no matter who he had to kill or what laws he had to break. This was the birth of the ruthless pragmatist, the man who would later look at the burning towers of Troy without blinking. The tragedy of the draft was not just that he had to leave, but that he had been forced to show his hand, to reveal the depth of his love and the sharpness of his mind to men who would exploit both. The madness had been a sanctuary, and now he was exposed to the elements. As the ships were prepared and the supplies loaded, grain, oil, wine, and weapons, Odysseus stood on the dock, looking back at the furrows he had made. The salt glinted in the sun, a white scar on the dark earth, a reminder that the world he was entering was one where nothing grew, only withered. He stepped onto the deck, his heart already hardening into the stone it needed to become. And as the island of Ithaca began to recede, he understood that the longest journey was not the one across the sea, but the one away from the man he used to be. As the ship cuts through the dark water, moving further from the fading scent of Ithaca's pine forests, the man standing at the helm is supported by more than just oak planks. He is buoyed by a lineage of shadow, a bloodline that prepared him for this moment of exile long before he ever held a spear. To understand the peculiar, jagged shape of Odysseus's soul, we must look past his royal father, Laertes, and peer into the darker branches of his family tree, specifically to his maternal grandfather, Autolycus. In the whispered legends of the Bronze Age, Autolycus was not a hero in the shining solar sense. He was known as the King of Thieves, a man who lived on the edges of the law and the wild, rumored to be a son of the trickster god Hermes. He was a master of disguise and manipulation, a figure who could, metaphorically, and perhaps literally in the eyes of his victims, change the color of the cattle he stole to avoid detection. This inheritance is crucial because it reveals that Odysseus is not merely a warrior. He is a genetic hybrid of nobility and criminality, a king who thinks like a bandit. The heroism of the Iliad is usually defined by BIE, the raw, overwhelming physical force possessed by men like Ajax or Achilles, men who solve problems by smashing through them. But Odysseus carries the blood of the trickster, the gift of Metis, a cunning, crooked intelligence that bends the world rather than breaking it. This is the quality of the ambusher, the trapper, the man who wins not because he is stronger, but because he has seen the trapdoor that everyone else missed. It is a dangerous gift, one that isolates him from the straightforward, honorable men he is sailing to join, for Metis is often viewed with suspicion, a weapon of the weak that becomes terrifying in the hands of the strong. This destiny of isolation was stamped onto him the moment he was given his name. It was Autolycus, the old wolf of Mount Parnassus, who traveled to Ithaca to name the newborn prince. Sitting by the hearth, holding the infant in his scarred, grasping hands, the grandfather did not choose a name that promised light or glory. He looked at the child and said, "In the course of my life, I have angered many men and women across the bountiful earth. Therefore, let his name be Odysseus, the man of enmity." The name itself is a curse and a prophecy. Derived from the Greek verb odyssos, it means to be wrathful against, to hate, or passively, to be the hated one. He is the man who gives and receives pain, a lightning rod for the friction of the world. Unlike other heroes whose names sing of strength or divine favor, Odysseus carries a name that essentially means the victim of hatred or the troublemaker. It is a heavy cloak for a child to wear, a constant reminder that his existence is defined by conflict, by the grinding friction of survival against a universe that wishes to crush him. As he stands on the deck, feeling the rhythm of the rowing men, he wears this name like his armor. He knows that he is not going to Troy to be loved. He is going to be the necessary evil, the man who does the things that the men of B are too proud or too stupid to do. But the lesson of his nature was not just learned in stories. It was carved into his flesh. If you were to look closely at his leg, in the flickering light of the ship's brazier, you would see the white, knotted ridge of an old scar just above his knee, a map of his first true encounter with death. It happened when he was a boy, sent to Parnassus to visit his grandfather and claim his inheritance. They went hunting on the slopes of the mountain, tracking a massive wild boar through the dense, tangled undergrowth where the sunlight struggled to penetrate. The boar is a creature of pure, unthinking violence, a living tank of muscle and tusk that knows no fear and offers no quarter. In the silence of the hunt, the beast exploded from its lair, a blur of bristling darkness. The young Odysseus, eager to prove his courage, rushed forward with his spear, but the boar was faster. It charged, its tusk slashing sideways, ripping through the flesh of his thigh to the bone, a wound that should have ended his story before it began. Yet, in that explosion of pain and adrenaline, Odysseus did not collapse. He drove his spear downward, piercing the beast's shoulder, and killing it even as his own blood steamed on the cold ground. This moment was his baptism. The scar became a permanent reminder of a fundamental truth. The world is a wild boar. It is violent, unpredictable, and faster than you. To survive it, you cannot rely on the hesitation of honor. You must strike simultaneously with the injury. You must accept the wound to deliver the kill. Historians still argue whether this boar hunt narrative is a remnant of an older coming-of-age ritual common to Indo-European cultures, a symbolic death and rebirth where the boy dies and the warrior is born. But for the character of Odysseus, it is the moment he learned the price of survival. The scar is his identity. Later, it will be the only way his old nurse, Euryclea, recognizes him when he returns in rags. It is the physical manifestation of his name, pain given, pain received. It separates him from the gods, who cannot be scarred, and from the dead, who feel no pain. It marks him as enduringly, painfully human. As the coastline of Greece begins to blur, the phantom ache of that old wound pulses in the damp sea air, a warning system that never sleeps. He is sailing into a war of 10,000 spears, but he knows that the sharpest weapon is the one hidden behind the eyes. He is the grandson of thieves, the bearer of the scar, the man of pain. The other kings, Agamemnon and Menelaus, are sailing for the honor of a stolen queen, treating the war as a grand pageant of their power. Odysseus knows better. He knows that war is just a larger, louder version of the boar hunt, a chaotic rush from the undergrowth where the only thing that matters is who is left standing when the dust settles. He leans against the railing, his knuckles white, and lets the darkness of his heritage wrap around him. He is ready to become the hated one, if that is what it takes to get back to the olive trees of Ithaca. The hero is dead. The survivor is at the helm. The keels of 1,000 ships did not kiss the sand of Troy. They bit into it, grinding against the foreign shore with a sound like a giant beast clearing its throat. A harsh, guttural announcement of arrival that echoed off the high limestone walls of the city in the distance. But if the Greeks expected the gates to fly open, or the armies of Priam to crumble at the mere sight of their bronze-clad fury, they were met only with the silence of stone and the whistling of the wind across the Scamander plain. The war did not begin with a roar. It began with the dull thud of dense stakes being driven into the mud, the sound of a temporary city being erected for a siege that would consume a generation. This is where the golden myth of the Iliad dissolves into the gritty logistical nightmare of history, a transition from the poetry of heroes to the prose of survival. We call it the Trojan War, implying a continuous, high-octane conflict of duels and chariots. But the reality for Odysseus and his men was a decade of corrosive waiting, a slow, grinding stalemate that was less about glory and more about disease, dysentery, and the frantic search for food. The rust of Aulis, that paralyzing stillness that had held them at the gathering port in Greece while they waited for favorable winds, had followed them across the Aegean, settling over the camp like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Imagine walking through that camp, not as a visitor to a monument, but as a ghost drifting through a shanty town of scavenged timber and rotting canvas. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, curing leather, and the overpowering stench of latrines dug too close to the waterline. The shining armor of the epic poems is nowhere to be seen. Instead, the bronze breastplates and greaves are coated in a layer of dull green verdigris, the inevitable result of salt air and neglect. Men sit in the shade of their beached ships, sharpening blades that have not tasted blood in months, their eyes hollow with a boredom that is more dangerous than any Trojan spear. This is the reality of Bronze Age warfare. It is 90% camping and 10% terror. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War was a single, cataclysmic siege as described by Homer, or if it was actually a composite memory of centuries of predatory raids and skirmishes over trade routes, compressed by the poets into one dramatic narrative. For the men on the ground, however, the distinction mattered little. They were trapped in a limbo between the lives they left behind and a victory that seemed to recede further with every sunrise. They were not fighting a war. They were living in a swamp of their own making. In this environment of stagnation, the traditional heroes began to wither. Achilles, the embodiment of Pi, sat in his tent, strumming a lyre, his immense physical power useless against walls that could not be stormed. Agamemnon, the High King, bickered over spoils and slave girls, his authority eroding with every day that Troy remained unconquered. But while the lions paced in their cages, the fox was at work. Odysseus did not rot. His mind, built for the complexities of survival rather than the simplicity of slaughter, found a new rhythm in the stalemate. He became the architect of the camp's endurance, the man who understood that a siege is not won by the sword, but by the stomach. He organized foraging parties, turning the war into a series of cattle raids on neighboring towns just to keep the army fed. He mediated the petty disputes that flared up like wildfires in the dry heat of the encampment, using his words to stitch the fraying coalition together. He saw the camp not as a staging ground for glory, but as a sinking ship that needed to be bailed out daily. He watched the horizon with the cold, calculating eyes of a man who knows that time is the enemy of the invader. The psychological toll of this rust was immense. The men began to forget the faces of their wives. The memories of their children became static, unmoving images that no longer sparked joy, only a dull ache. They were becoming creatures of the beach, defined by the sand in their food and the constant mocking presence of the impregnable city on the hill. The heroic code, the idea that you fight to be remembered, began to ring hollow when the only enemy you faced was a fever or a rusted nail. Odysseus felt this erosion more than most because he had the most to lose. Every day spent staring at the walls of Troy was a day stolen from Ithaca, a day where his son was growing up without a father, where his kingdom was left unguarded. The rust was not just on the armor, it was on his soul. He could feel his humanity stiffening, flaking away, replaced by a cynical hardness necessary to endure the endless waiting. He began to realize that the old ways of war, the honorable duel, the open field battle, were obsolete here. The walls of Troy were a puzzle that force could not solve. This realization alienated him even further from men like Ajax, the giant of Salamis, who still believed that if he just hit the gates hard enough, they would fall. Ajax was a creature of the daylight, a man of simple, brutal integrity, who could not comprehend a war that refused to be fought. Odysseus, however, was becoming a creature of the twilight. He spent his nights wandering the perimeter of the camp, listening to the murmurs of mutiny, watching the fires of the Trojans flickering on the ramparts, and understanding that if they were ever to go home, the rules would have to be broken. The stalemate was a crucible. It burned away the illusions of chivalry and left only the hard slag of necessity. It was during these long, empty years that Odysseus began to sharpen the weapon that would eventually end the war. Not a spear, but a lie. He saw that the heroic age was dying on this beach, suffocated by its own inefficiency. The world didn't need another Achilles. It needed a trickster. It needed someone willing to descend into the mud, to do the work that the poets would hesitate to sing about. As the 10th year of the siege dawned, the atmosphere in the camp shifted from boredom to a dangerous, brittle desperation. The supplies were running low, the ships were rotting from the inside out, and the men were looking at their leaders with eyes that asked a terrifying question. Why are we still here? The rust had eaten through the discipline of the army. Something had to break. The silence of the stalemate had become deafening. A tension pulled so tight that it hummed in the air like a bowstring about to snap. Odysseus stood by the water's edge, watching the waves wash away the footprints of the patrol, and knew that the time for waiting was over. The era of bio, of force, had failed. The era of metis, of cunning, was about to begin. The rust had done its work. It had weakened the structure of the old world, enough for him to tear it down. He turned his back on the sea and looked toward the tents of the commanders, his mind already weaving the nets that would catch them all. The war was dead. Long live the trick. The smoke from the funeral pyre of Achilles has finally dissipated, drifting up to join the clouds that hang low and grey over the Trojan plain. But the vacuum left by his death is a physical thing, a sudden, terrifying emptiness in the center of the Greek camp. For 10 years, the army had orbited around the gravitational pull of the swift-footed hero, assuming that his rage and his spear were the axis upon which the war turned. Now he is ash in a golden urn, mixed with the bones of his beloved Patroclus, and the survivors are left staring at the one thing that remains: his armor, set up on a wooden stand in the center of the assembly ground. The divine gear forged by the god Hephaestus gleams with a supernatural malice. The shield, etched with the intricate cosmos of the living world, cities at peace and cities at war, vineyards and dancers, seems to mock the dead men who covet it. This is not just protective gear. It is the symbol of supremacy, the title belt of the best of the Achaeans. Possession of this armor declares the bearer to be the successor of Achilles, the new alpha of the coalition. And so, the war pauses for a different kind of combat, a duel not of bronze against flesh, but of philosophy against philosophy, fought between the two men who represent the fracturing soul of the Greek world, Ajax the Great and Odysseus. On one side stands Ajax, a man who is essentially a living fortress. He is the cousin of Achilles, a giant of a man who carries a shield made of 7 layers of ox hide and 1 layer of bronze, a tower behind which the Greeks have hidden for a decade. He represents the old way, the code of Piae, where a hero's worth is measured by the weight he can lift and the ground he refuses to yield. He has carried the body of Achilles out of the fray, while Odysseus merely covered the retreat. He has stood alone against the Trojan charge while others fled. To him, the armor is his by right of blood and sweat. He stands before the judges, the weary kings and generals, and points to his scars, to the dented rim of his shield, to the sheer, undeniable mass of his service. His argument is brief, blunt, and honest. I am the wall. I held the line. Give me the prize. He does not know how to spin words because he believes that deeds speak for themselves. He is a creature of the daylight, incapable of deceit, and in a fair world, he would be the king. But the world has changed. Standing opposite him is Odysseus, the man of Metis, who understands that the war has evolved beyond simple strength. He looks at the judges and sees not warriors, but politicians, men who are tired, frightened, and desperate for a solution that does not involve running into a spear. Odysseus does not point to his muscles. He opens his mouth, and the sharper spear begins to do its work. His speech is a masterpiece of rhetorical violence. He weaves a narrative that reframes the entire war, arguing that, while Ajax may save the ships, it is the mind of Odysseus that guides them. He asks, what good is the strength of a bull without the herdsman to direct it? He paints Ajax not as a hero, but as a mindless tool, a blunt instrument that is useful but expendable. He claims credit for the recruitment of Achilles, for the logistics of the camp, for the strategies that have kept them alive. He turns the very virtues of Ajax, his silence, his steadfastness, into liabilities, portraying him as a dinosaur in a new age of tactical warfare. It is a public evisceration, surgical and cold. The judges, swayed by the intoxicating power of his logic, and perhaps fearing the sharp edge of his intellect more than the blunt force of Ajax, cast their votes. The armor is awarded to Odysseus. The verdict hits Ajax like a physical blow. It is not just a loss of a prize. It is the invalidation of his entire existence. The army has declared that honor no longer belongs to the strong, but to the clever. That night, the tragedy of the contest for the arms spirals into a nightmare that is both heartbreaking and grotesque. According to the cycle of myths, Ajax, driven mad by grief and humiliation, and perhaps the influence of Athena, who always favors Odysseus, suffers a psychotic break. He believes he is attacking the Greek commanders who betrayed him, slaughtering them in their tents. In reality, he is in the sheep pens, hacking apart livestock with his sword, screaming insults at rams and ewes he believes to be Agamemnon and Odysseus. It is a scene of utter degradation. The greatest warrior of his age, covered in the blood of farm animals, wrestling with shadows in the dirt. When the madness lifts with the morning mist and he sees what he has done, the shame is absolute. He cannot live in a world where he is a laughingstock, where the heroic code has been twisted into a lawyer's debate. He plants his sword in the earth, point upward, and falls upon it, the only enemy he could not defeat being his own obsolescence. Odysseus's role in this tragedy is passive yet devastating. He never drew a weapon against Ajax, yet he is the architect of his death, as surely as if he had cut his throat. Historians still argue whether the judgment of arms represents a genuine historical shift in Greek values. The transition from the feudal warlord ethos of the Mycenaean period to the more cunning polis-oriented politics of the later archaic age, or if it is a literary device to purify the narrative, removing the one hero who could not fit into the duplicitous world of the Odyssey. Regardless of the scholarly debate, the result for the character is a further hardening of the heart. When Odysseus claims the armor, he does not wear it with the joy of a victor. He wears it with the heavy knowledge that he has cannibalized his own side to survive. He has eliminated the Greeks' greatest shield because it stood in the way of his ambition. The death of Ajax is the moment Odysseus crosses a line from which there is no return. He has accepted that in this broken world, it is better to be a live dog than a dead lion. As he stands over the body of his rival, watching the blood soak into the thirsty Trojan dust, Odysseus feels the chill of a terrible solitude. The old guard is gone. Achilles is dead. Ajax is dead. The monsters of the battlefield have been cleared away, leaving only the manipulators, the schemers, the survivors. He touches the cold bronze of Achilles' armor, now his, and realizes it does not make him feel invincible. It makes him feel targeted. He has won the war of words, but the victory is ash in his mouth. The camp is quieter now, fearful of the man who can kill with a whisper. Odysseus turns away from the suicide, his face a mask of impenetrable calm. But deep down, the hated one knows that he has just added another ghost to the crew that haunts his wake. He has survived, yes, but he has done so by extinguishing the brightest light left in the army. The armor fits, but it feels like a stolen skin. The age of heroes is officially over. The age of the liar has begun. The sun sets on the 11th year of the war. But for the first time in a decade, it dips below a horizon that is terrifyingly empty. The 1,000 black ships that once crowded the bay like a plague of locusts have vanished, slipping away behind the silhouette of Tenedos, leaving behind only the smoking footprints of their camp, and a silence so profound it feels like a held breath. On the trampled sand of the beach, where the blood of heroes once soaked into the earth, there stands a single, solitary object that defies explanation, a towering wooden monstrosity hewn from the sacred fir trees of Mount Ida, standing on thick, rolling plinths. This is the horse. In the soft, forgiving light of the moon, it looks almost peaceful, a votive offering abandoned by a defeated army. But to the man curled in the fetal position within its hollow belly, it is a coffin waiting to be sealed. Odysseus is crammed into the dark, resin-scented claustrophobia of the wooden cavity, pressed shoulder to shoulder with 30 of his best killers, including the builder Epius and the son of Achilles, Neoptolemus. The air inside is hot, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, oiled bronze, and the sharp tang of fear sweat. This is the weapon of mass deception, the final desperate gamble of a man who realized that Troy could not be taken by force, only by a trick so audacious, so sacrilegious, that it would exploit the very virtues of the enemy against them. The plan is pure metis, turn the Trojans' piety into their executioner. The inscription carved into the wood dedicates the statue to Athena, a peace offering for a safe return home, making it a religious object that the Trojans would fear to destroy. Odysseus is betting everything on the theological panic of the city, counting on them to drag the death trap inside their own walls to appease the gods. Outside, the world is celebrating the end of the apocalypse. The Trojans, seeing the empty beach and the gift, believe the miracle has finally happened. They pour out of the Scaean gates, touching the grass where the Greeks used to camp, weeping with relief. They argue over what to do with the horse, a debate that nearly kills the men hiding inside. They listen as the priest Laocoon hurls his spear into the flank of the horse, the bronze tip thudding into the wood inches from a man's face, causing the timber to reverberate like a hollow drum. In the darkness, Odysseus clamps his hand over the mouth of a soldier who is about to scream, his grip like iron, silently commanding absolute stillness. They hold their breath as sea serpents rise from the deep to devour Laocoon, a sign, the Trojans think, of divine punishment for doubting the gift, but which Odysseus knows is a dark favor from Poseidon or Athena. The debate ends. The decision is made. The Trojans, drunk on relief, drag the massive idol toward the city, dismantling the lintel of their own gates, the very walls that stood for 10 years against the fury of Achilles, to accommodate the belly of the beast. The irony is sharp enough to cut. The city is not breached by a battering ram, but by its own hands, welcoming its destruction with garlands and songs. Inside the horse, the sensation is one of sickening motion. The men lurch and sway as the wheels grind over the paved streets, the sounds of joy and flutes penetrating the thick planks. It is a psychological torture of the highest order. Odysseus sits in the dark, visualizing the geography of the city he has studied from afar for a decade. He knows they are passing the temples, the market squares, the houses where families are currently toasting to peace. He feels the weight of the sacrilege he is committing. This is not honorable combat. This is a violation of the laws of hospitality and the sanctity of the gods. He is smuggling murder into a sanctuary. Historians still argue whether the horse was a literal wooden statue, a battering ram covered in damp hides to prevent fire, or perhaps a metaphor for an earthquake sent by Poseidon, the earth shaker who was often symbolized by a horse, that shattered the walls and allowed the Greeks to enter. But for the narrative of the night, the literal truth matters less than the symbolic one. Odysseus has turned himself into a virus, bypassing the immune system of the city to attack it from within. Night falls, heavy and moonless. The celebrations die down, replaced by the heavy, stuporous silence of a city that has drunk itself into oblivion. The guards, believing the war is over, have abandoned their posts or fallen asleep in drunken heaps. Inside the horse, the heat has become unbearable, the air thin and stale. Odysseus waits. He is the master of timing, the man who knows that patience is a weapon as lethal as a sword. He waits for the signal from Sinon, the spy left behind on the beach, to light the beacon that will summon the fleet back from Tenedos. He waits until the breathing of the city slows to the rhythm of deep sleep. Then, and only then, does he nod to Epius. The carpenter, his hands trembling slightly, undoes the bolts of the hidden hatch. A sliver of cool night air rushes into the fetid hold, tasting of freedom and imminent violence. Odysseus peers out, looking down from the height of the horse's belly onto the sleeping citadel. The city of Troy, the jewel of Asia, lies spread out before him, vulnerable and exposed. It is a moment of supreme power and supreme horror. He is looking at a corpse that doesn't know it is dead yet. He drops the rope ladder. It uncurls silently, dangling like a spider's thread. One by one, the men descend, their armor wrapped in wool to muffle the sound, their movements fluid and practiced. Their feet touch the stone of the citadel, the sound softer than a whisper. There is no battle cry. There is no challenge. There is only the efficient, silent dispersion of shadows. They move to the gates, slaughtering the sleeping sentries before they can even draw a breath, their knives flashing in the starlight. They swing the great doors open, revealing the Black Sea beyond, where the returning Greek fleet is already beaching, disgorging thousands of vengeful men who have waited 10 years for this moment. Odysseus stands at the center of the silent square, the wooden horse looming above him like a dark god. He has done it. He has unlocked the puzzle. But as he draws his sword, looking at the peaceful homes around him, he knows that what happens next will not be war. It will be a liquidation. The Metis has succeeded, but the cost will be the complete erasure of a civilization. The hated one has brought the night inside the walls, and as the first torch is lit to signal the start of the burn, the silence of the horse is replaced by the first scream, a sound that will echo in his ears all the way back to Ithaca. The siege is over. The slaughter has begun. The city of Troy does not fall like a tree with a single clean crash. It dissolves like flesh in acid, a slow, agonizing liquefaction of stone and humanity under the heat of 1,000 torches. If the wooden horse was the masterpiece of Metis, the night that follows is the breakdown of the human soul, a descent into a frenzy where the distinction between soldier and butcher evaporates completely in the smoke. The streets, once paved with the orderly commerce of the Bronze Age, are now slippery with a dark, viscous mud made of wine, oil, and blood. The sound is not the clash of armies, but a cacophony of individual tragedies, the splintering of doors, the shrieking of women, and the guttural roars of men who have forgotten their names. Odysseus moves through this inferno not as a warrior seeking glory, but as a grim auditor of the destruction he unleashed. He watches as the discipline of the Greek army, held together for 10 years by the promise of this moment, shatters into pure, avaricious anarchy. They are not satisfied with victory. They want erasure. They are stripping the gold leaf from the statues, tearing the earrings from the lobes of weeping noblewomen, and hacking apart the very altars of the gods they claim to serve. It is here, in the flickering hellish light of the burning citadel, that the Greeks lose the war in the very moment they win it. They commit the ultimate sin of hubris, forgetting that while a city can be sacked, the gods who dwell within its temples cannot be mocked without consequence. The specific atrocities of the night are etched into the mythological record like scars. Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, seeking to outdo his father's reputation for violence, finds the aged King Priam seeking sanctuary at the altar of Zeus. In a world governed by rules, the altar is inviolable, a safe zone where no sword may be drawn. But Neoptolemus is a creature of the new godless reality. He drags the old man through the slick blood of his own son, Polites, and butchers him on the holy stones, turning a sacred space into a slaughterhouse. Elsewhere, in the temple of Athena, the lesser Ajax finds the prophetess Cassandra, clinging to the statue of the goddess. He drags her away with such force that the statue itself is said to have toppled, her prayers ignored by men, but heard by the heavens. These are not acts of war. They are acts of sacrilege. They are the reason the wind will soon turn against them. Odysseus, pragmatic and cynical, likely sees these excesses as dangerous liabilities, not because of their cruelty, but because of their stupidity. He knows that to desecrate a temple is to invite a curse, and as he watches the flames lick the roof of the palace, he can almost feel the eyes of Athena, his patron, his protector, hardening into flint. The Greeks are sowing the wind, and they will reap the whirlwind on the journey home. But the coldest, most terrifying calculation of the night falls to Odysseus himself. It concerns Astyanax, the infant son of Hector, the last true heir to the throne of Troy. As long as the boy lives, there is a seed of vengeance that could one day sprout into a new war. The other kings might hesitate, swayed by the pity of a mother's tears, but Odysseus operates on the logic of the preventative strike. He argues with a chilling, lawyer-like precision that it is foolish to kill the father and spare the son. The decision is made not in the heat of rage, but in the cool quiet of a council meeting amidst the ruins. The child must die. The myth tells us that Odysseus, or perhaps Neoptolemus, acting on Odysseus's orders, takes the baby from the arms of Andromache and throws him from the high walls of the city. It is a moment of absolute moral darkness. There is no glory in it, no combat, only the sickening thud of a small body hitting the rocks below, a sound that signifies the final death of Troy's future. Historians still argue whether this specific infanticide is a poetic invention to highlight the brutality of the Greeks or a reflection of the ruthless dynastic extermination practices common in ancient warfare. But the result is the same. Odysseus has survived, but he has paid for his survival with his humanity. He has looked into the eyes of a child and seen only a political variable to be eliminated. As dawn breaks over the smoldering ruin, the silence returns. But it is the silence of the graveyard. The city of Troy 70, the archaeological layer most often associated with the Homeric Troy, shows evidence of a catastrophic fire, with skeletons found in the streets and piles of unburied slingstones, a testament to a frantic, hopeless defense. The Greeks load their ships with spoils that now seem accursed. Statues with hollow eyes, women who stare blankly at the horizon, chests of gold that smell of smoke. The joy of the Nostos, the homecoming, is tainted. There is no cheering as they push the ships back into the water. There is only a hurried, guilty haste to leave the scene of the crime. The smoke from the burning city rises in a black column that can be seen for miles, a signal to the world that the great power of the East has fallen, but also a signal to the gods that the Greeks have gone too far. They have not just defeated an enemy, they have violated the fundamental order of the cosmos. As Odysseus stands on the deck of his black ship, watching the ruins disappear into the mist, he feels the first drop of rain on his face. It is not a cleansing rain. It is the beginning of the storm. The gods have convened, and the verdict is exile. The man who orchestrated the fall of a city will now find that the world itself has turned against him. He has 10 years of wandering ahead of him. A penance for the night he let the monsters out of the horse. The victory is complete, but the price is everything. The storm that swallowed the fleet after the sacrilege of Troy was not merely a weather system. It was a divine boundary line, a violent curtain that separated the known world of maps and trade routes from the uncharted geography of the soul. For 9 days, the ships were thrashed by the north wind, blown past the familiar landmark of Cape Malaya, the turning point where a sailor usually pivots north toward home. Instead, they were driven relentlessly south and west into a stretch of ocean where the stars seemed to shift in the sky and the water turned a strange, milky turquoise. When the wind finally died, it did not fade into a natural calm, but collapsed into a heavy, suffocating stillness. The sails hung limp, useless canvas ghosts against the masts, and the air grew thick with a scent that was sweet, cloying, and unnervingly familiar, like the smell of a funeral wreath left too long in the sun. They had arrived at the land of the Lotus Eaters. To the exhausted men, bleeding from the disastrous raid on the Cicones and trembling with the aftershocks of the Trojan slaughter, this coastline did not look like a threat. It looked like a bed. The light here was permanently golden, an eternal hazy afternoon that softened the sharp edges of reality, making the jagged prows of the ships and the scarred faces of the rowers look like watercolor paintings rather than hard matter. Odysseus, ever the paranoid surveyor, sent 3 men inland to scout, expecting monsters or an ambush. What they found instead was a terrifying benevolence. The inhabitants were not warriors. They were dreamers, people who moved with the languid slowness of underwater swimmers, their eyes wide and dark, reflecting a peace that the Greeks had not known for a decade. They did not offer poisoned spears. They offered a flower. The lotus, described in the Odyssey, is a botanical enigma, a fruit that tastes of honey and oblivion. Historians still argue whether the land of the Lotus Eaters corresponds to the island of Jerba off the coast of Tunisia, where the local Sisyphus lotus fruit has been consumed for millennia, or if the plant was a poetic cipher for the opium poppies or Egyptian blue lotus used in the ancient world to induce altered states of consciousness. But for the narrative of the soldier, the taxonomy is irrelevant. The lotus was the first opioid crisis. It was the ancient world's answer to PTSD. Imagine the scout, a man whose hands are still stained with the dry blood of the Trojan War, whose nights are plagued by the screams of burning horses and dying friends. He takes the fruit, perhaps hesitant at first, and bites into it. The effect is instantaneous. The noise in his head, the constant grinding roar of survival, the guilt of the survivor, the panic of the ocean, simply stops. It is replaced by a warm, viscous silence. The memory of Ithaca, of his wife, of his duty to his king, does not disappear. It just ceases to matter. It feels heavy, like a burden he can finally set down. Why return to a rocky island to plow salt fields? Why row until his hands blister? Why fight? The lotus offers the one thing a warrior craves more than victory: the permission to stop. The three scouts sat down among the friendly, smiling locals and wept, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming, narcotic relief. They had defected from the army of the living. When Odysseus went to find them, he encountered a scene that chilled his pragmatic blood. He found his best men sitting in the dust, staring at the horizon with glassy, contented eyes, refusing to acknowledge his orders. They did not recognize his authority because the lotus had dissolved the social contract. To Odysseus, who defined himself by his struggle, by his ability to remember and plan, this vegetative bliss was more horrifying than the spear of Hector. A monster can only kill your body, but the lotus kills your name. It erases the nostos, the return, which means it erases the story. If they stayed here, they would vanish from history, becoming nameless shadows in a field of flowers. It was an existential suicide. This is where Odysseus revealed the terrifying rigidity of his will. He did not debate philosophy with the addicts. He did not plead. He used force. The scene of the extraction is brutal and pathetic. Odysseus and the remaining loyal crewmen had to physically tackle the lotus eaters, dragging them weeping back to the ships. These were grown men, veterans of the greatest war in history, kicking and screaming like toddlers, begging to be left behind. "Don't make me go back," they might have cried, clawing at the sand. "Don't make me remember." They weren't fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their numbness. Odysseus was implacable. He hauled them over the gunwales and threw them under the rowing benches, lashing them tight with ropes. He was the jailer of their consciousness, forcing them to remain present in a world of pain they desperate wanted to escape. He understood that survival requires suffering, that to be alive is to feel the sharp edge of the wind, the ache of the muscle, and the sting of loss. The lotus was a false peace, a premature death. As he shouted orders to push off, panic in his voice, commanding the rest of the crew to row for their lives before they too succumbed to the temptation of the honey-sweet fruit, Odysseus looked back at the shore. The lotus eaters stood watching, not angry, just disappointed, waving slowly in the golden haze. They were the ghosts of what the Greeks could have been if they had just given up. The ships cut through the surf, shattering the glassy water, and as the effects of the fruit began to wear off, the three bound men under the benches began to scream again, the memories of the war rushing back into their minds like a breaking dam. Odysseus stood at the helm, his jaw set, listening to their anguish. He had saved them. Yes, he had preserved their lives and their chance to see home. But as he steered them back into the cold, grey reality of the open sea, he must have wondered if he had done them a favor. He had dragged them out of heaven and chain them back to the oar, condemning them to the long, hard struggle that lay ahead. He had chosen reality over happiness, a choice that would define every league of the journey to come. The drug was gone, but the hunger for it would remain, a phantom ache in the belly of the ship, reminding them all that the hardest part of the war was not fighting it, but living with it afterward. The coastline faded, the sweet scent replaced by the smell of brine and sweat, and the nightmare of the Odyssey truly began. The fog that lifts off the water the next morning reveals an island that seems to have been forgotten by time itself. There are no plowed fields here, no council meetings, no ships with crimson prows. There is only the raw, unchecked abundance of nature. Wild wheat, heavy grapes, unharvested by human hands, and the bleating of goats echoing off limestone cliffs. This is the land of the Cyclopes, a place that exists outside the boundaries of civilization and the laws of hospitality that the Greeks hold sacred. To Odysseus, a man obsessed with discovery and acquisition, the island is not a warning, it is a temptation. He leaves the safety of the main fleet on a nearby islet and takes his own ship, driven by a fatal curiosity that he masks as exploration. He wants to know what kind of men live here, but more importantly, he wants Xenia, guest gifts, the treasure a host is socially obligated to give a visitor. It is this greed, disguised as diplomatic protocol, that leads him and 12 of his bravest men into the gaping maw of a cave high in the hills, a cavern that smells of old milk, damp wool, and something else. Something copper and stale that pricks the hairs on the back of their necks. They enter as burglars, eating the cheeses drying on the racks, waiting in the gloom for the master of the house to return. When the ground begins to tremble, announcing the arrival of the shepherd, they realize too late that they have walked into a tomb. Polyphemus is not a man. He is a force of nature, a mountain of muscle with a single, glaring eye in the center of his forehead that lacks the depth perception for empathy. He drives his flock into the cave and seals the entrance with a boulder so massive that 22 wagons could not shift it. The darkness that falls is absolute. The Greeks are trapped in the bottle. When the giant spots them, crouching in the shadows, he does not offer wine or water. He asks about their ship, probing for weakness. Odysseus, his survival instinct flaring, lies instantly, claiming his ship was wrecked, hoping to invoke pity. But the Cyclops knows no pity. In a moment of shocking, casual violence, he snatches up 2 of the men and dashes them against the floor like puppies, devouring them raw, bones and all. The horror of the scene is not just the gore, it is the complete negation of humanity. To Polyphemus, Odysseus and his men are not heroes or kings. They are simply meat. The sacker of cities is helpless, reduced to watching his friends be eaten by a creature that does not speak his language of power. The men weep in the corner, paralyzed by the sheer biological impossibility of their situation. They cannot fight him. His strength is Be incarnate, and they cannot kill him in his sleep. For if they do, they will never move the stone to escape. They are locked in a room with a cannibal, and the key is too heavy to lift. But where strength fails, Metis awakens. Odysseus spends the night in a cold sweat, his mind racing like a rat in a maze, until he constructs a plan that hinges on 2 things: a skin of unmixed, potent wine he brought from the priest Maron, and a linguistic pun. The next evening, After the giant has eaten 2 more men, Odysseus offers him the wine. It is a sweet, heavy vintage meant to be diluted with water, but the Cyclops drinks it straight, bowl after bowl, falling into a drunken stupor. "What is your name?" the monster asks, slurring, promising a gift in exchange. Odysseus leans in, the firelight dancing in his eyes, and delivers the stroke of genius. "My name is Utis," he says. "My name is Nobody." The giant laughs, promising to eat Nobody last, and passes out. This is the trap. Odysseus and his men take a stake of olive wood, symbolically the wood of Athena, harden it in the fire, and drive it into the single, sleeping eye of the monster. The scream that shakes the cave is primal, a sound that vibrates in the marrow of their bones. Polyphemus stumbles blindly, roaring for help, calling to his neighbors. The other Cyclopes gather outside the sealed cave, asking who is hurting him. "Nobody is killing me," Polyphemus howls from within. "Nobody is hurting me by fraud and not by force." The neighbors, hearing this, assume it is a sickness from Zeus and walk away. The linguistic trick has stripped the monster of his community. Metis has defeated muscle. The escape the next morning is a masterpiece of tactile desperation. Blind and raging, Polyphemus rolls away the stone to let his sheep out, sitting in the doorway with his hands spread to catch the men. Odysseus ties his surviving crew under the bellies of the massive rams, 3 sheep per man, while he himself clings to the underside of the largest ram, burying his fingers deep into the thick, lanolin-rich wool. He hangs there, suspended over the abyss, his breath held tight in his chest, as the giant's hands sweep over the fleece, inches from his spine. The tension is excruciating, a silent, slow-motion crawl toward the sunlight. When they finally clear the cave and release their grip, tumbling onto the grass, the relief is so intense, it feels like intoxication. They drive the sheep to the ship, push off into the surf, and row for their lives, the water churning white under their oars. They are safe. They have beaten the monster. The story should end here, with a humble escape and a lesson learned about the dangers of greed. But Odysseus cannot let it end. He is a hero of the heroic age, and in his world, a victory does not count unless the enemy knows who defeated him. As the ship puts distance between them and the shore, the adrenaline of survival curdles into the poison of hubris. Odysseus stands on the deck, ignoring the desperate pleas of his men to stay silent. He cups his hands around his mouth and shouts back at the blind giant on the cliff. "Cyclops, if any mortal man asks you who blinded you, tell him it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, who lives in Ithaca." It is a moment of supreme arrogance and the turning point of his entire life. He has given the monster his address. Polyphemus, hearing the name, realizes that an old prophecy has been fulfilled. He does not throw a rock this time. He throws a prayer. He lifts his hands to the sky and calls upon his father, Poseidon, the lord of the earthquake and the sea. Grant that Odysseus may never reach his home in Ithaca. But if he is destined to see his friends and his house, let him come late, in bad case, with the loss of all his companions, in a ship that is not his own, and let him find trouble in his house. The prayer is heard. The sea darkens instantly, the waves taking on a new menacing weight. Historians still argue whether this episode represents the historical Greek fear of the lawless Western Mediterranean, or a psychological allegory about the danger of the ego. But the consequence is undeniable. By reclaiming his name, Odysseus has signed the death warrant of his crew. He has made himself a personal enemy of the ocean itself. The stone that Polyphemus throws in response splashes behind the ship, pushing them towards the open water. But the curse has already landed on the deck, invisible and heavy. As they sail away, the men look at their captain with a new kind of fear. He saved them from the cave, yes, but his pride has just sold them to the storm. The man who called himself nobody was invincible. The man who calls himself Odysseus is doomed. The sun sets on a sea that is no longer just water. It is a hunting ground, and they are the prey. The sea has become a prison, a vast watery labyrinth where every direction leads only to more suffering. After the disaster with the Laestrygonians, giants who spewed rocks and speared men like fish, and the strange seductive interlude on Circe's island, Odysseus is stripped of his fleet. He is down to one black ship, a solitary hearse drifting on the edge of the known world. But the true test of his endurance is not found on the waves. It is found beneath them. Circe, the witch goddess, who turned his men into pigs before taking Odysseus to her bed, offers him a route home. But it is a path that no living man should take. She tells him he must sail to the house of Hades, the realm of the dead, to consult the shade of the blind prophet Tiresias. It is a psychological pivot point. To go forward, he must go down. He must undergo a catabasis, a descent into the underworld, to face the ghosts of his past before he can have a future. The journey takes them to the river Oceanus, the dark, encircling stream at the limit of the earth, a place of perpetual mist and cloud where the sun never shines. Here, on a beach of black sand, Odysseus performs the necromantic ritual. He digs a trench with his sword and pours libations of milk, honey, wine, and water, followed by the blood of a black ram and a ewe. The smell of the fresh blood acts as a beacon in the grey twilight, drawing the thirsty dead up from the gloom like moths to a flame. They come in swarms, brides, old men, warriors still wearing their blood-stained armor, shrieking with thin, bat-like voices. Panic grips Odysseus. He grips his sword, his knuckles white, holding back the tide of souls, waiting for the prophet. But before Tiresias arrives, other faces emerge from the mist, faces that shatter his composure. He sees his mother, Anticlea. He had left her alive when he sailed for Troy, waiting by the pillar of his house. Now she flits before him, a wisp of smoke. When he finally allows her to drink the blood and speak, she tells him the truth that breaks him. She did not die of illness or old age. She died of pothos, longing for him. His absence was the weapon that killed her. Odysseus tries to embrace her 3 times, and 3 times she slips through his arms like a shadow or a dream. It is a devastating physical lesson in the cost of his glory. He is a king who can conquer cities, but he cannot hold his mother. The underworld strips away the illusion of his power, showing him that while he was busy being a hero, the people he loved were dying of heartbreak. Then, the shadow of Achilles approaches, the greatest warrior of the Iliad, the man who chose a short life of eternal glory over a long life of obscurity, now stands before Odysseus in the gloom. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, tries to comfort him, praising his fame, calling him a prince among the dead. But Achilles spits the words back at him with a bitterness that overturns the entire heroic code. Do not speak soothingly to me of death, glorious Odysseus. I would choose to be a serf on the land of a poor man who had little to live on, rather than be king over all the crumbling dead. It is the most shocking line in Greek literature. The man who lived for fame now realizes it is worthless compared to the sensation of sunlight on skin or the taste of bread. This revelation hits Odysseus like a physical blow. He realizes that the currency he has spent his life hoarding, honor, reputation, the songs of poets, is counterfeit in the face of death. Survival is the only thing that matters. The bee of Achilles led to a tomb. The metis of Odysseus must lead to life. But the most chilling encounter is the one that does not happen. The shade of Ajax appears, the man Odysseus defeated for the armor, the man whose suicide he caused. Odysseus speaks to him with genuine remorse, asking him to put aside his anger, blaming the gods for the madness that took him. But Ajax does not speak. He stands in silence, his resentment preserved perfectly in the cold air of Hades, and then turns his back, walking away into the deeper darkness. It is a moment of profound judgment. Odysseus realizes that some wounds cannot be healed, some sins cannot be forgiven, even in death. He is carrying the weight of these ghosts, and he will carry them forever. The underworld is not just a place of prophecy, it is a mirror. It shows Odysseus what he has become: a man of blood, a killer of friends, a son who killed his mother with his ambition. Tiresias finally arrives and gives him the route home, warning him about the cattle of the sun god, Helios. If you harm them, I prophesy the ruin of your ship and your men. But the damage is already done. Odysseus climbs back up to the world of the living, but he is not the same man. He has looked into the abyss and seen that glory is a lie. The journey continues, but the ruthlessness of Odysseus now has a new, desperate edge. He knows the stakes. When they pass the sirens, he has himself tied to the mast so he can hear their song, the song that promises knowledge of all things, while his men row with wax in their ears. He wants to know everything, but he makes sure he cannot act on it. Then comes the terrible choice of Scylla and Charybdis. On one side, a whirlpool that will swallow the entire ship. On the other, a six-headed monster that will eat 6 men. It is a trolley problem on the high seas. Odysseus does not tell his crew about the monster. He gives them a pep talk, telling them to row hard while secretly steering them towards Scylla. He watches as 6 of his best men are snatched from the benches, dangling in the air like fish on a hook, screaming his name, Odysseus, for the last time. He sacrifices them to save the rest, a cold, calculated transaction that defines his leadership. He does not freeze. He does not weep until it is over. He is the captain of the sinking ship, the man who cuts the limb to save the body. Finally, on the island of Thrinacia, the prophecy of Tiresias comes true. Stranded by winds, starving, his men disobey him and slaughter the sacred cattle of Helios while Odysseus sleeps. The sacrilege is absolute. When they finally launch the ship, Zeus strikes it with a thunderbolt. The black ship explodes. The men are scattered like seabirds on the waves, bobbing for a moment before vanishing into the dark water. Odysseus alone survives, clinging to a piece of the wreckage, drifting back toward Charybdis. He hangs from a fig tree over the whirlpool, waiting for hours as the abyss swallows his raft and spits it back out. He is the last man standing, the nobody who is now truly nobody, a king without a kingdom, a captain without a crew. He drifts for 9 days, sun-baked and salt-crusted, until he washes up on the island of Ogygia, the prison paradise of the nymph Calypso. The underworld taught him that life is precious, but the sea has taught him that life is lonely. He is alive, but he is a ghost in his own story. A survivor who has paid for his breath with the lives of everyone who ever trusted him. The sand of Ithaca, when he finally touches it, does not feel like a welcome. It feels like a question. Odysseus wakes up on the beach of his home, not in the warm embrace of his family, but in a thick, supernatural mist conjured by Athena to hide the landscape from his eyes. For a terrifying moment, the master of landways and seaways believes he has been tricked again, dropped on yet another foreign shore by the Phaeacians, who sailed him home in a magical sleep. When the goddess finally disperses the fog and reveals the familiar jagged cliffs and the olive trees of his youth, the joy is instantly tempered by a cold, paranoid caution. He does not run to the palace to announce his return. He knows that a king who has been missing for 20 years is not a ruler. He is a rumor, and rumors are easily silenced by a knife in the dark. If he walks through the front door as Odysseus, he will be dead before sunset. So, the final leg of the journey requires the greatest transformation of all. Athena touches him with her wand, withering his skin like old parchment, dimming the fire in his eyes, and turning his auburn hair into dirty grey rags. The man who sacked Troy, who blinded a giant and walked through hell, is reduced to a beggar, a shuffling, lice-ridden vagrant. It is the ultimate camouflage. To reclaim his throne, he must become the lowest creature in his kingdom, a ghost haunting his own life to see who remains loyal and who has sold him out. His first stop is not the high halls of the nobility, but the pigsty of Eumaeus, the swineherd. This choice is significant. In a world of crumbling alliances, Odysseus finds honor only in the mud. Eumaeus is a prince of swineherds, a man who has maintained the estate and the memory of his master with a religious devotion, unlike the aristocrats who are currently tearing the palace apart. Odysseus sits by the fire, eating simple pork and listening to the gossip of the island, testing the waters. He learns the scale of the disaster. 108 suitors, the sons of the local nobility, have occupied his house. They are not merely wooing his wife Penelope. They are an occupying army. They slaughter his cattle daily, drink his best wine, and sleep with his female servants. They are eating the oikos, the household economy, down to the bone. It is a slow-motion coup, a dismantling of his legacy through gluttony rather than war. Odysseus listens, his head bowed, his heart hardening into a knot of cold fury. He reveals himself only to his son, Telemachus, in a brief, tearful reunion that is quickly stifled by the necessity of the plot. There is no time for father-son bonding. There is only time to plan the execution. They agree on the strategy. Telemachus will hide the weapons from the great hall, leaving the suitors defenseless when the trap springs. The walk to the palace the next day is a journey into the heart of humiliation. As Odysseus limps through the gates of his own courtyard, disguised as the beggar, he encounters a sight that nearly breaks his resolve. Lying on a dung heap, infested with ticks and half-blind, is Argos, the hunting dog he bred before he left for Troy. The dog was once swift and strong, a symbol of the kingdom's vitality. Now, like Ithaca itself, it is neglected and dying. Yet as the beggar passes, the old dog lifts its head. It pricks its ears and wags its tail, the only creature on the entire island that recognizes the master beneath the rags. Odysseus cannot stop. He cannot kneel to comfort the animal without blowing his cover. He turns his face away to hide a single tear, perhaps the only honest tear he sheds in the entire epic, and enters the hall. Behind him, having seen his master one last time, Argos lowers his head and dies. It is a quiet, devastating moment that underscores the cost of the 20-year absence. The old world has waited for him, but it has withered in the waiting. Inside the great hall, the atmosphere is a sensory assault. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and the boisterous, drunken laughter of the suitors. They are young, arrogant, and completely unaware that they are dining with death. Odysseus, playing the part of the beggar, moves among them, asking for scraps of bread. It is a test of xenia, of hospitality, and they fail spectacularly. Antinous, the ringleader of the suitors, a man of cruel vanity, is offended by the beggar's presence. In a fit of rage, he hurls a footstool at Odysseus. The heavy wood strikes the king on the shoulder, a blow that would knock a lesser man down. But Odysseus stands firm as a rock, his physical strength momentarily flashing through the disguise. The room goes quiet. He does not strike back. This is the supreme test of his metis, the ability to suppress the bailli, the urge for immediate violence in favor of the long game. He takes the blow, swallowing his pride, storing the pain as fuel for the slaughter to come. He is studying them, memorizing their faces, counting their numbers, marking exactly where they sit. He is not a guest. He is a predator observing the herd. That night, there is a clandestine meeting with Penelope. She sits by the fire, questioning the stranger about her husband. Odysseus sits across from his wife, the woman he rejected immortality for, and lies to her face. He spins a yarn about meeting Odysseus years ago, describing his clothes and his brooch with perfect accuracy to prove his story, making her weep with longing. Historians and literary critics still argue whether Penelope sees through the disguise, whether her decision to hold the contest of the bow the next day is a coincidence or a tacit signal that she knows the executioner has arrived. There is a deep, unspoken current between them, a game of shadows where two master strategists are aligning their plans without breaking character. She announces that she will marry the man who can string Odysseus's great hunting bow and shoot an arrow through the sockets of 12 axe heads. It is a task that only one man has the strength and skill to perform. Odysseus, the beggar, listens and nods. "Do not delay this contest," he whispers. "The stage is set. The weapons are hidden. The doors will soon be locked." As he lies down to sleep in the vestibule, listening to the laughter of the maids slipping off to the suitors' beds, Odysseus feels the vibration of the bow he has not touched in 20 years calling to him. The time for cunning is over. The sun will rise on a day of judgment. The stranger is about to vanish, and the king is about to wake up. The hall of Odysseus is quiet now, save for the crackling of the hearth and the heavy, nervous breathing of 108 men who are staring at a beggar holding a weapon of kings. The contest of the bow has ended, and the failure of the suitors is absolute. Not one of them could even bend the stiff ox-horn limbs of the great weapon, let alone string it. They have been exposed as soft men, parasites living on the memory of a hero they presume dead. Now, the stranger holds the bow. He turns it in his hands with the casual intimacy of a musician handling a lyre, checking for worm rot or fractures, ignoring the sneers of the young aristocrats. When he finally moves, it is not with a grunt of exertion, but with a fluid, terrifying grace. He strings the bow in a single motion, plucking the gut string so that it sings through the silent hall with a note that sounds like a swallow's cry. A high, sharp pitch that raises the hair on their arms. Outside, a single peal of thunder rolls across the clear sky, a sign from Zeus that the time for games is over. The atmosphere in the room shifts instantly from mockery to a cold, paralyzed dread. Odysseus does not aim at the axes immediately. He picks up a bronze-tipped arrow, fits it to the string, and without even rising from his stool, sends the shaft flying. It hisses through the handle holes of all 12 axes, a perfect, impossible shot that threads the needle of destiny. He drops the bow, throws off his rags, and stands revealed in the firelight, the scar on his leg gleaming, the king returning to his throne not with a scepter, but with death in his hands. "Dogs," he roars, his voice breaking the spell. "You thought I would never come home from the land of Troy." The first arrow is not a warning shot. It is an execution. It catches Antinous, the leader of the pack, in the throat just as he is lifting a golden goblet of wine to his lips. The cup falls, the wine mixing with the blood on the floor, a grim callback to the senior they violated. The suitors jump from their seats, looking for the weapons that usually hang on the walls, but the walls are bare. Telemachus has done his work. They are trapped in a stone box with a wolf. What follows is not a battle. It is a liquidation. It is the brutal, systematic restoration of order through extermination. Odysseus shoots until the arrows are gone, each one finding a mark, and then the spears come out. The descriptions in the sources are not romantic. They are visceral and horrific, detailing the chaotic, slippery mess of close-quarters slaughter. Athena raises her aegis, her shield of terror, from the rafters, and the suitors panic, scattering like cattle stung by gadflies. But the doors are barred. There is no exit. The hated one is purging his house, washing the shame of 20 years away with a river of aristocratic blood. But the darkness of the Odyssey's conclusion is found in what happens after the men are dead. The hero does not stop with the combatants. He turns his gaze to the household staff, specifically the 12 maids who had slept with the suitors and disrespected the queen. In a modern narrative, we might expect mercy or a trial, but the Bronze Age logic of Odysseus is absolute and terrifying. He orders them to clean up the carnage, to scrub the blood of their lovers from the floors and carry out the bodies, forcing them to participate in the erasure of their own lives. When the work is done, he does not exile them. He orders Telemachus to execute them. They are herded into the courtyard and hanged in a row, like thrushes or doves caught in a net, their feet twitching for a little while, but not for long. It is a moment of profound cruelty that strips the final veneer of nobility from the protagonist. He is not a knight in shining armor. He is a warlord reasserting ownership over his property, human and otherwise. The peace of Ithaca is bought with a mass grave. The reunion with Penelope is the only softening note, and even that is defined by suspicion. She tests him one last time, asking the nurse to move their marriage bed. Odysseus, in a flash of genuine anger, reveals that the bed cannot be moved because he carved it himself from the living trunk of a massive olive tree around which the entire palace was built. It is the ultimate symbol of his stability, the one thing in his life that is rooted and unshakable. Only then does she believe him. They weep together, but their happy ending is a brief candle in the dark. The Odyssey ends here, but the mythology, preserved in the lost epic known as the Telegony, continues into a final, tragic chapter that history often forgets. The prophecy of Tiresias stated that death would come to Odysseus from the sea, or away from the sea. The Greek is ambiguous, and that it would be a gentle death. The reality, however, is a bitter irony. Years later, a young warrior lands on Ithaca, raiding the cattle to feed his crew. This is Telegonus, the son Odysseus fathered with the witch Circe during his year on her island. He has come searching for his father, but he does not know the face of the king. Odysseus, now an old man but still possessive of his property, rides out to drive off the pirates. Father and son meet on the beach, ignorant of their bond. They fight. Telegonus carries a spear tipped not with bronze, but with the poisonous spine of a stingray, a weapon from the sea. In the skirmish, the boy thrusts the spear, and the spine pierces Odysseus's side. The venom does its work. The man who survived the Trojan War, the Cyclops, the underworld, and the wrath of Poseidon, dies on the sand of his own island, killed by his own son, a consequence of a forgotten sin from his long journey home. It is the final receipt for the life he lived. The cycle of violence that began with the boar hunt on Mount Parnassus ends with a stingray on the beach of Ithaca. The man of pain receives his final wound, and the sea, which he fought for so long, finally claims him. Historians still argue whether the Telegony was a later addition meant to tie up loose ends or the original intended tragic conclusion to the cycle, but it fits the character perfectly. Odysseus was a man of consequences. He left pieces of himself, children, enemies, ghosts, on every shore he touched, and in the end, one of those pieces followed him home. As he lies dying, perhaps he looks at the waves one last time, not with fear, but with recognition. The storm is finally over. The cleverest man in the world has run out of tricks, and the silence that falls over Ithaca is the silence of a debt finally paid. The king is dead. The myth remains, and the sea continues to wash against the shore, indifferent, eternal, and victorious. And now the bow is unstrung, the hall is swept clean, and the ships are pulled up high on the sand, resting from their long journey. The fires have burned down to glowing embers, casting soft, pulsing shadows on the stone walls, and the voices of the past have faded into the quiet rhythm of the night. The shouting is over. The pain is a distant memory, smoothed over by the passage of 3,000 years. All that remains is the sound of the ocean, the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the world, rising and falling, rising and falling. Let the story drift away from you now, like a leaf floating on a calm, dark stream. You do not need to carry the weight of the shield or the worry of the map anymore. You are safe in the harbor, far from the storms and the monsters. The history is written, the ghosts are at rest, and the stars are wheeling slowly overhead, watching over you with 1,000 silent eyes. Let your breathing slow down to match the tide, deep, slow, and peaceful. The world is soft, the night is kind, and the journey is done. Sweet dreams.